you simplify this for somebody who's still scratching their head thinking, how can this monkey be worth $1 million?
The one that I gave at TED remains probably the easiest one, which is we're going to have an agentic AI that actually really does things for itself. I think this is both a little bit scary, but at the same time fascinating. If we can find ways to preserve creativity at the younger age, at the top of the funnel, right? If you can do that, you can get a double-digit outcome at the bottom. For the last 4 years, about $48 billion worth of airdrops have been given.
$48 billion. We either do this or we die. How many times has that happened to you?
More times than I can count, I would say.
Yat Siu is the co-founder and CEO of Animoca Brands, a leader in digital assets and the Metaverse. He pioneers innovations in gaming and blockchain, aiming to empower individuals with self-sovereign digital ownership.
CryptoKitties basically broke Ethereum at $40 million of sales. AI isn't just a tool for someone that follows our instructions. There was this big scandal about, so who owns the genetic data now?
How did your purpose change from music to gaming and technology?
That journey really is.
If we had to ask you to reimagine a world where AI and blockchain, two technologies which are very close to your heart, come together, what will that world look like? What are we looking at in the next 2, 3, and 5 years with this technology?
Well, I mean, if you think about what AI really needs to actually have power and be self-sovereign, it needs to have something like blockchain because it needs to be on a data structure that can't be really turned off. So that's kind of one thing. And then the second thing is because an AI has the ability to generate currency, meaning in this case, a crypto token, for instance, it has the ability to pay people. It can also receive and trade tokens, whether it's a stable coin or whether it's Bitcoin, doesn't really matter. So that means for the first time an AI isn't just a tool for someone that follows our instructions. It can have truly agency of its own. So when we talk about agentic AI, I think most people talk about the agent that does stuff for you. But in this case, we're going to have an agentic AI that actually really does things for itself in certain forms or fashion. And I think this is both a little bit scary, but at the same time fascinating. Today, we already work for platforms on blockchain, with airdrops. Like every time you do something for protocol or for Web3 game or whatever that may be, you get dropped some tokens, and then people kind of work for you in a way. So what's the difference between working for an L1, L2 blockchain or working for an agentic AI? I don't really think there's that much of a difference. And just to give you some context of the value, for the last 4 years, about $48 billion worth of airdrops have been given.
$48 billion.
That's right. So that's probably one of the largest wealth generation sort of events that happened really over the last couple of years. It's also one of the reasons why so many people are flocking towards Web3 and blockchain industry as a whole. It's not just because of Bitcoin. It's actually there's employment opportunities that can happen there, except they're now giving up our protocols / future AI agents. So I think it's a fascinating future. I think the other thing is also gaming, right? When you look at the world of gaming, most people don't really appreciate that gaming is actually the place where we have most of the AI interactions. It's a dumb AI because of cost. However, there's 3.4 billion people playing games,
and
engaging.
NPCs, yeah.
Exactly, engaging with NPCs. And these NPCs are primitive AIs, but you start infusing them with a little bit more intelligence, and that's actually what we engage in. And we're already emotionally connected to it already. I know a lot of people use ChatGPT and talk to them almost like as a friend or get personal advice. But still, it pales in comparison to the number of people who have sort of these type of relationships, even if they're not as good with AI games, AI agents inside games.
No, but what you just talked about is kind of fascinating. If AI has agency of its own and its own currency, it could start bribing people to keep it itself alive or do things which may or may not be correct.
I mean, I think so. So I think the question is, what's the purpose of the AI, right? And if the AI is programmed with a certain purpose, it will fulfill that. The thing is, unlike, for instance, the human mind or the human consciousness, we have the ability to change our mind on stuff. But with an AI, depending on how it's programmed, maybe it can't change. And so it has only one direction. And that could sometimes turn very, very ugly. Which is why we think, again, blockchain technology is the solution, because through DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, we can have ways in which you can vote towards where the direction of the AI goes, where it's community controlled. One of the problems we have with AI right now is it's a black box. And
controlled by just a few people.
Yeah, it's controlled just by a few people. Whereas if you actually tokenized it, it could be controlled by a community. whether you trust the community or not, that may be a different question. But I would say I'd much rather have a democratically owned and governed and controlled AI than one that is in the hands of the few.
You talked about AI with a purpose. So let me take you back to your own childhood, Yat. You started with a family whose purpose was music and arts and creativity, and you yourself got trained as a classical musician. How did your purpose change from music to gaming and technology?
I think that journey really is, I think, a classical child's journey in a way. I mean, my parents were immigrants. I grew up in Austria and Vienna. That certainly sort of shaped me in certain interesting ways.
The musical city.
But the musical city, particularly classical music. But I think when you're growing up as a child, and I think this is true probably for a lot of children, you look up to your parents in a way. And your purpose, perhaps as much as the parents' purpose is around ensuring that the child is growing up a certain way, I think a child's purpose is very much sort of looking for the endorsement and the approval of your parents. Right? I would say that's kind of a natural journey for a lot of children. And certainly growing up in a Chinese family as an only child, I didn't really have a choice. I had to study music. And also appreciating that at the time in the 70s and 80s, immigrant families really wanted to make sure you integrated. So it wasn't the case of, do whatever you want. It was more like, you're going to make stuff that I can help you with. So that was music. And at the same time, something that would ideally integrate you sort of with society. So German was my mother tongue. It still is my mother tongue, although, I don't use it for business, but it's something that I'm very comfortable with. And when I studied music, I wasn't very good as a musician compared to my peers. And I ended up using a computer to basically help me cheat a little, as it were.
Auto-tune at that time.
Well, it wasn't really so much auto-tune. It helped me compose, right? And I had a MIDI port. And that basically allowed me to sort of, do a little bit better. And I got appreciated from another online community that was pre-internet, from people on CompuServe, that really became my community. And it was, interesting enough, not someone who was my neighbor. It was actually someone, in America or in Texas or in Minnesota or somewhere around the world. I don't even know where they're from. And we basically ended up having a virtual friendship. And that's actually really what the internet is about today, but that was in the 80s. And that kind of sort of saw me.
It was called the Bulletin BBS.
It was a BBS. CompuServe was a BBS. It was pre-internet, absolutely pre-internet. I think the journey, if I have to say, what did music do other than sort of get me into the tech space that way? The other thing that I think a lot of people might not appreciate about music, and I think this is maybe again something that we think about sort of our human connection and how we sort of relate to each other, is the key thing about music is harmony, right? And of course, the thing that doesn't work is disharmony. And there are rules as well, which means that music is about systems and it is about patterns. And I think what music helped me do was it helped me be maybe a little bit better at pattern recognition. And that means, and also not just at pattern recognition, but also at working with others. If you work in an orchestra, right, you're not actually just playing by yourself. You're not a soloist. And a lot of people assume that you have to follow the conductor and tells you what to do. But in reality, you're a team together. You have to sort of empathize with others. You have to see how they're reacting. You have to follow with that flow. But there are rules, right? And in music, you have rules, right? Whether it's blues scales, whether it's some kind of harmony, all those type of things are rules. So we all know the rules, but we can maybe work better if we know each other. And we can therefore also predict what we do, which is why when you see musicians, when they go in, it feels like magic when they just like play a tune and someone else just comes in and just plays together with them and jams with them. You're like, oh my goodness, like you're a musical genius. They're very good at it, but they have rules to follow on. But the ones that really are good are the ones who don't just know the rules, but can actually predict where you're going next so they can actually harmonize with you better. And I think for people who have to look at where the world might be going or make assumptions about sort of some kind of predictions, I think music does help you do that.
I think you've put a very interesting context around music, but tell me, what were your parents thinking when they saw that we thought that we have a son who's going to be a musician, and you started making MIDI tunes and taking the sound panel apart?
Yeah, I don't think my mom really knows what I do right now properly. And she's because she was a musician, she's not going to be the classic sort of accountant, lawyer, doctor type of Asian parent, but it was still based on what she understood. And being a parent myself now, I realized really what she was trying to do is she was trying to protect me, and she was trying to sort of give me something that she thought she could help me with, which was music. And that was her passion. And today we much better understand that our children are different and we are different. And just because, our parents are a certain way doesn't mean that we're that way. But I would say our parents' generations and my parents' parents' generation as grandparents, they definitely did not think this way, right? It was more like, if I did this, you do this, because I can maybe help you, but also because you're family, it's my blood. So aren't you also a musician just because I'm a musician? And as it turns out, that's not really true, right? We're all very individual. And this idea of individualism is really also a concept that popularized more in recent history, and also comes from an environment where we have plenty. So this luxury of individualism we can afford today, for the most part, particularly in the West. But when my parents moved from Chinese-speaking region, basically to Austria, immigrated, that it was actually in the 60s. And for those of you who know a little bit about Chinese history, that was Cultural Revolution. So it was like no idea and no intention of ever moving back to China. Right. It was kind of like, imagine telling people who might have, fled a war zone, say like Somalia, to say, oh, and by the way, in about 10, 20 years' time, you're going to go back and do business there. Unthinkable for that generation.
And that's exactly what my question was, that because I know Austria led you to Germany where you were with Atari, but you could have very easily gone to the West and been in the US and Silicon Valley and everything, but you decided to go east to Hong Kong.
So I would say, first, the world of travel and immigration wasn't quite so simple. Right. The reason why people end up in Austria at the time was because they couldn't get to either the US, okay, or UK and maybe Germany. Austria was kind of like I wouldn't say leftover, but it was basically
like a little haven.
It was another haven to go to if you couldn't get somewhere else. So it was definitely not the first choice. And maybe specifically for my parents, so my mom really wanted to go to Austria because she wanted to study music, so that was specific for her. But we had like a Chinese community of, I think it was like 100 Chinese people in maybe all of Austria. And most of them, didn't want to go to Austria. They wanted to use it as a stepping stone to maybe go to the UK, for instance, right? Because those were the places to be. And America was the ultimate goal for probably most Chinese, and actually I think also Indian families at the time, right? That was kind of the dream place to be from an immigration standpoint.
No, but what got you to Hong Kong then?
Well, it was just serendipity, right? And I think if I look at my life, all of these things were serendipitous. I mean, the fact that I made a connection with people online and wrote software, it wasn't planned. It was, something happened. My father became more of a businessman. He brought a computer back home in the 80s to help with the accounting. And of course, the accountant is like, I know what this is. Okay. And I'm going to do my stuff with my typewriter and write stuff with a classic handwritten ledger, and didn't want to deal with that. So he brought the computer home because nobody else was going to use with it. And it had a game cartridge. The game was called Parsec. I started playing games with it, but it also had a basic prompt. And I started tinkering around with
Basic. It's called GW Basic.
Yes, it's very, very early forms of Basic. And I was just playing around, and I said, oh, wow, I can make these changes. And hey, that's interesting. It can help me with math in a way that I couldn't do before. So I just started tinkering with it and just ended up sort of appreciating that. And then because of that experience, when I wrote that software later on the Atari and put it on CompuServe, the software was discovered by Atari. And Atari was like, oh, we like what you wrote. Why don't you pop over, for a potential job, not knowing I was a kid. And then I pop over and they're like, how old are you, right? And I still got the job. So it wasn't like I had a plan for any of this. And this entire journey where I ended up going to Hong Kong wasn't planned either. What happened was I went to the US because I needed a formal computer science education because Austria didn't have one at the time, because we're talking about the 80s. Midway through my studies, Atari went under. Right? So the Atari of today has nothing to do with the Atari of back then. Yeah. We started a business that was basically helping people who still had Atari computers but needed support because there was nowhere there to support it, and morphed that later on into a business that was building basically modeling tools for SGI, Silicon Graphics, for those who may remember.
Those Onyx machines, I remember those Onyx machines.
Running on IRIX, right?
Yeah.
And we were one of the first companies to basically write virtual reality modeling tools VRML, which
Yeah.
is basically the
I
predecessor.
remember VRML totally. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, you're one of the few. Most people are like, what's VRML, right? But basically, the VR version of HTML. They acquired the business, SGI acquired the business as part of SGI WebForce. Now, going back a little bit in time, in the early 90s, around 92, 93, really the internet machine was Sun Microsystems.
Yep.
And actually, what people were sort of, SGI had a little bit of Sun envy and wanted to also go into the internet space. And so they started this thing called SGI WebForce and were acquiring all these companies to basically build out a sort of multimedia answer to what Sun Microsystems
And I
was
remember
doing.
Maya and all these tools
Yes,
only
exactly.
worked on SGI.
That's right, exactly. Maya was one of the most famous modeling tools at the time. And when they acquired the business, they're like, okay, we need some people to help us in Asia, to help us sort of, teach the software. And back then, in the 90s, going overseas to Asia was hazardous, which meant you got more pay, you got more benefits. I was single. And plus, you look Asian. You want to go to Asia? I'm like, sure, I don't care. Because people didn't want to travel. So I ended up first having a post in Tokyo. Then I was in Taipei. And then I came to Hong Kong. And two things happened in Hong Kong. One, because my father is originally from Hong Kong, I got a permanent residency. I didn't really know what that meant. It basically means you get 3 stars on your ID card. And my colleagues were like, why do you have 3 stars? It's like, oh, interesting. They just gave it to me when I sort of applied for an identity card. So I could live there and work there without any visa. And then the second one was I couldn't get my email. They didn't have a CompuServe node, and I couldn't get internet either. And that was the beginning of saying, you know what? Internet was good for me. So I think we should give internet to everyone. And it could be business. And that's actually when I ventured to really form my very first solo business, which was an ISP in maybe 94 or something.
Yeah. I mean, this is like even pre the .com days, right?
Yes,
This is like
pre.com, called Hong Kong Online, somewhat inspired by America Online, as a consumer-facing ISP. Lots of difficulty setting it all up, but it was fun at the time. And the entire internet line was 64K. I had a 64K.
And that too, it must be like one of those leased lines.
It's a leased line.
Yeah.
It's a leased line, and then I basically had sort of dial-up modems. I remember most of them were 19200 baud, back in the days, and of the early days of the internet. So that was the origin of that.
And you ended up selling this business to IBM. I mean, how was...
That happened many generations after.
Yeah.
So I didn't sell that business to IBM.
that was Outplace.
That was Outplace. So the business, what happened with Hong Kong Online was nobody wanted internet service because they're like, well, I can just send stuff with DHL. Okay, and I ended up carving a little niche for sort of companies who needed to have high resolution scanning, and instead of doing stuff over FedEx, just basically scan it and then send it over, and it would maybe take several hours, but you could do that. And we actually used a pre-email tool at the time called CC Mail.
Oh, I know CC.
Yeah, CC Mail, right? This was before Lotus Notes even came about.
And pre-SMTP this is.
Well, so we had to build SMTP wrappers. Okay, we had to build SMTP wrappers so they could go over the internet, because CC Mail was actually an intranet tool originally, right? So that was kind of sort of part of that origin story. And later on, I couldn't really make enough money with this business. I ended up making a free sort of email service, which became known as Hong Kong Cyber City. And I thought I could sell advertising. Now, this was 95, 96. Nobody was buying advertising. But we had 300,000 users at that point.
And mostly from Hong Kong?
They were all from all over Asia, really.
All over
Not
Asia.
from Hong Kong only, all over Asia. They were all young people, meaning they had no money, but they had a lot of time. So I remember when people would upload their content, kind of similar to GeoCities. I organized, it's called Cyber Cities because it was organized into sort of virtual cities. What actually happened was people would wait literally hours for the content to be uploaded. It's hard to imagine today that you would have this patience, but you had to wait until it was your turn to queue it.
And I remember we used to even wait for hours for one frame to render when you were doing like 3D Studio. And
Oh yes, exactly. And we had to deal with all these kind of rendering techniques like Phong and whatever, just to make sure that, because you couldn't get photorealism. It would take you like literally weeks, if not a month, in order to get that.
And you were still using dot matrix printers that time, right?
We had dot matrix printers. I think laser was just beginning. Actually, this is kind of fun because when I started Hong Kong Online, and later on we became Cyber City, we were using Next machines as our servers, running on FreeBSD.
Wow.
Right.
Among the few Next machines maybe in this part of the world.
Yeah,
I guess.
or maybe in history for that matter, right?
Yeah.
And we were early proponents of open source. Anyway, long story short, what happened was in 97, 98, the dot-com bubble started to rise. And even though I wasn't making any money on Cyber City, there were companies in America who needed to buy eyeballs to basically grow that business and show that we had internet traffic, and we were one of the target companies. They acquired that business, which was effectively my first real exit. Got screwed many ways, but anyway, it doesn't really matter. The point is that we sort of learned some lessons, and with that, I still wanted to be in the internet, but I was not going to run a portal given everything that was going on. So instead, started Outblaze, which was at the time called an ASP. Application Service Provider.
ASP, wow.
Yes.
But that name, possibly you were using that name for the first time, maybe.
I think we were one of the very first ones using it, which is really just a fancy way to say cloud computing.
Yeah.
But cloud computing came later.
Yeah.
And we became one of the largest email service providers. And that business is what you were talking about. It's the one that we sold to IBM back in 2009.
No, and I think and it's about that same time I started coming to Hong Kong because we sold part of our business to Tom Online and Tom Group.
Yes, that's correct. Exactly. Yeah, and Tom Online was was a consumer service, but they ended up branching out to all sorts of things. But it was your classic .com company at the time.
Li Ka-shing owned, and I think Selena used to run Tom Online.
Yeah, and then
Group.
also I think I forgot his name, but anyway, yes, but it was part of the.
So literally, from 2004 to 2006, I used to be in Hong Kong every quarter. So
Yes.
Hong Kong had a big part, and I think during that I met you and
yes,
Yusuf
exactly.
and
Exactly. Back in the early days,
you know.
when we were a little younger, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
so tell me something. How many times before Animoca you have come to the stage that, listen, this is our last dollar left and there's no more runway. We either do this or we die. How many times has that happened to you?
I don't know, more times than I can count, I would say. Because there's always crisis of one form. And I think one thing that happens when you're an entrepreneur, especially when it's a business you started and you own most of the shares, the company's balance sheet is your balance sheet. That's kind of how I think of it. And not in the sense that the balance sheet is my balance sheet, but rather we're the backstop. So there were many times where, even during the growth of Outblaze, because we had SARS, right?
Yeah.
We had, or when Gmail basically came out and said, because, our email business was actually growing quite well.
And there's Hotmail, and I think there was you
Yes.
and there were 2-3 others.
Exactly, like Critical Path, ComTouch, those guys, But however, the competition, Hotmail, gave out 5 megabytes. 5 megabytes of storage. Whoa, right? So we gave out 20, okay? And we were like leading. And then, I think it was 2005, 2006, Google decided to come out and say 1 gig.
Yeah.
Right, just like that, right? Or maybe it was 100
MB.
megs
They
first.
started 100
MB,
megs, yeah.
and then later on 1 gig. Either way, it was like unfathomable for us to compete because the pricing model just couldn't compete with that kind of storage, even though we were open source. And so completely flipped the business upside down. And these are, and you always get through these moments, and I think they accelerate further and further, where you have to sort of make sure that you have enough reserves. And of course, when you're a young startup, you don't really have that, which means that your personal balance sheet ends up being the one that ends up backing up the business to sort of help support that. And so I would say we've met many of those sort of crisis points, shall we say, where we had to sort of make these decisions. And it comes with conviction and belief that you think this is going to work. And so I would say dozens and dozens.
So the most common theme with what you've been doing, Yat, is you've always been trend spotting, like you just said. You are always looking at these patterns. Because I remember at TED, we were having breakfast. I think this is 2016 or 2017. And you told me about CryptoKitties. And I was like,
Right.
What is CryptoKitties? And you had just invested in them. And you were all excited. So tell me, how did you find these CryptoKitties and what was the story behind you investing in them?
Yeah, so actually we helped build CryptoKitties, and this was in 2017 because our
And
studio...
the team was in Vancouver itself.
It's in Vancouver,
Yeah.
exactly. And that studio in Vancouver was actually sharing an office with the company that was building CryptoKitties on the tech side, and they were doing the gamification side. And that eventually that company became Dapper Labs. And the person who was leading that effort for us, ended up becoming one of the co-founders of Dapper Labs, right? So that was kind of the backstory towards it. And for those of you who are not too familiar, CryptoKitties really was the first mainstream NFT that basically broke Ethereum at $40 million of sales. And even though that's not very large in today's context, it sort of gave an inkling as to where the future could go and really laid the foundation of what we saw around digital property rights. We're like, oh, wait a second, we can actually own our digital assets that way. And it wasn't like a Bitcoin thing in terms of a currency or an asset in that way. It was much more something that sort of encapsulated our culture, that was really appealing. But to your question as to how we spot these trends, I wouldn't say that we're actively spotting trends as if we don't have a research team and sit there and go, this is where we think the world is going. I think it's just, you're users in the space and you try to look for things that solve problems. So for instance, the way that we got into the gaming space, this was the origin of Animoca before it became Animoca Brands, was really when I became a parent. I had a young child, and I needed to have a solution for my flashcards. For those of you who might remember back in the day, literally they had flashcards like these. There was an image and there was a graphic, and you would basically flash the card in front of the image and you say apple or pear or onion or house or something.
And that's how you taught kids in that day.
Yeah, and that's and we were basically told the story that you do this, your child will get smarter. And every first time parent is like, my child needs to be smarter, right? Do all sorts of stuff. Of course, today we know that a lot of this is just bullshit. However, at the time, and Baby Einstein was the name of that company, really raked it in. Like it was like 20 cards for like $19. I mean, it was just like, it was cardboard, and it wasn't even that special. But it wasn't the cost of the card that bothered me. What bothered me was that, basically a pack of 20 cards is gone in like, a minute or two. So could you not just help me make an app? And at the time, the first iPhone came out around that same time, that I can basically just put those flashcards on there, and it would just, at the time they didn't even have voice, but eventually say it. And then, I could just carry around on my phone all the flashcards rather than putting everything together. And what happened is that through that experience, not only was it convenient for me, it turned out that millions of other people thought it was convenient too, which then opened up the opportunity to, what's happening here with the iPhone? Why is that so powerful? And at the same time, learning more about app development, which then later on led the path and journey towards launching things like Pretty Pet Salon and launching sort of mobile games because of that experience. So it's not that the path is certain. It's just that you solve problems that you think are important, either for yourself or for others. And then through that journey, things open up. And I would say also because I was a very prolific investor from an angel perspective, not looking specifically for returns, but more like supporting people. And then you learn what they're doing and you end up making returns as well in some cases. And all of these things become information points. And that just became a little bit our philosophy, which we started also moving on to the business itself, which is why Animoca today is probably one of the largest, if not the largest, Web3 investors, certainly in quantum of companies.
No, and your TED talk, which talked about digital colonization and digital property rights, which went viral and it kind of shook a lot of companies. And today, all the regulators and governments in the world are exactly fighting this.
Correct.
So tell me, what in your journey led you to finally become, and I'm going to call you an activist on digital rights, because what you are building is actually what is totally wrong. We are trying to fix what is totally wrong with today's internet.
Yeah. So the product of how I think and how we think as a business isn't one moment. I think it's a series of moments, childhood experiences, everything. I think it goes all the way back. And again, I wouldn't know that when I was a child, but it helped me shape my thinking later on. So I grew up in Europe in the 70s and 80s. That was a time when we still had East and West Europe. My mom used to work at the Komische Oper in the eastern side of Berlin. So I would cross the border and I would see what true communism was like. Not that I would necessarily appreciate it, but it definitely was 1984. And so that had an impact on me. And I certainly knew what I didn't want and what was not right. But I grew up in a socially democratic country, which had capitalism, but very light, right? It was mostly state-controlled still. And then I went to America, and then I saw capitalism everywhere, and everyone was talking about money rather freely. And then eventually, for work, I ended up in places like Hong Kong, where it was capitalism overdrive, where literally there was no social security when I got there, and you had 60, 70-year-old grandmas literally pulling trash up because there was no other way to make money. Like, you basically the full spectrum, right? Going from communist to sort of communism all the way to sort of, unabated and actually very extractive forms of capitalism. So it saw that whole range. And so those are things that I spotted as things that I thought weren't right, but I didn't really have an answer towards. I didn't really understand that. And then the journey of becoming a parent, having to send kids through schooling, understanding what that was like, and then eventually launching, starting with the open internet, going into launching a game company that was actually one of the biggest mobile game companies up until 2012 when Apple deplatformed all of us, all of our apps, because
this is there's a feature phone era.
Yes, exactly. It was actually smartphone. They already had the early form of smartphone, but they removed all of our apps, and an entire business with 130, 140 people was completely at risk. And I couldn't imagine that, this sort of open source era of internet that we built, which we now call Web 1, could now turn into basically what became Web 2, which is these walled gardens. So it's these series of experiences that helped shape that thinking. But of course, back when Apple deplatformed us, I didn't really know about blockchain or what blockchain could do. NFTs hadn't arrived yet, and I wasn't fully aware of Bitcoin. So from my vantage point, that was, we didn't have a solve for it. But all these experiences were necessary. Then when we saw NFTs, it all clicked. If I had seen NFTs maybe even 10 years earlier, I'd be like, maybe interesting, that's kind of cool. Yeah, I can trade my digital assets and so on. But I didn't really understand the deeper meaning behind it. And it happened very quickly because once we started looking at digital property rights for gamers, we started realizing actually it's much more than that. Then we also realized that actually what was really powerful about Web3 and what was really powerful about property rights was composability. The ability to compose on top of things because you had ownership. Like the fact that you own a car is a reason why Uber or Lyft is possible, or someone can make tires for you, or leather seats, or baby seats. And we started exploring more deeply the meaning behind all of that. And then it basically became this full-blown mission around, hold on, this is how we create a much more democratic, a much more free, a better and fairer internet.
And you in fact said that digital rights are the new human rights. You kind of compared it to something as important as basic human rights.
Absolutely.
And why do you think those rights are being violated today?
Well, the rights are completely violated because you don't own anything digitally, and all the time you spend online is effectively rented. So
we're literally slaves.
We are. I called it, and I think in my talk I've sort of described it as we're digitally colonized, and we live in a digital feudal society, and we were ruled by the House of Google, the empire of Facebook. You name the Web 2 platform, that's actually those companies are the ones who control us. A lot of people might not fully recognize the fact that if you have 1 million followers on Instagram, they're not yours. They can take away from you anytime. Right? The person who used to own the X handle on Twitter lost it. Right? And also the person who had the music handle lost it. The person who had the Metaverse handle on Instagram was lost her handle because of impersonating, even though she had it 10 years before Facebook had it, because they renamed themselves, right? Because at the end of the day, it was never theirs to begin with. And that's why blockchain is powerful, because now you can actually really have sovereign ownership in the same way that you can know for sure that you own your Bitcoin, you can now own your digital identity. And the other thing also is that what we also came to realize is that in Web3, through tokens, you actually own a network, a part of a network effect. And the most valuable thing are these network effects that are being refined from our data. I mean, OpenAI, Instagram, TikTok, none of those companies would be successful if it wasn't for the users. Yep. The users we provide the value. Why aren't we getting paid for it? And why aren't we getting a share in that value?
It's interesting that, whenever people talk of NFTs, they show Bored Ape and says, how can this monkey's photo be worth so many millions? And you had a great explanation about what is the value behind these NFTs.
Yeah,
So how do you simplify this for somebody who's still scratching their head thinking, how can this monkey be worth $1 million?
Well, I've refined my argument a little bit since the days, but I think the one that I gave at TED remains probably the easiest one, which is, you don't buy a Birkin bag to put stuff in it, right? And you also don't buy a Rolex to tell the time. These are actual sort of cultural status outputs that mean something more than that. And in fact, I would argue that 99% of what we pay for in all of our items, actually the value is entirely cultural and symbolic that represent a form of status or identity that you want to display. If we actually really only were buying things for our utility, all the time, then cars would all be black and they would only take us from point A to point B, and we should all be wearing dark clothes and nothing else because they don't get dirty as easily and it would be cheaper as well. And yet here we are, Every person in every room you go to wears different clothes, has different glasses, has different identities because they want to be individual in their expression. And I also gave this example that in the video gaming industry, we spend about $100 billion a year on these virtual objects that have only decorative purposes. And really, they're not worth anything per se in terms of its utility because they don't make you better gamers or faster or so on. They really just are there for decoration. So we already do that in the world of fashion and then arts, media, and entertainment. But the other thing that I also point out to people in terms of virtual property rights versus physical, because a lot of people conflate that and they say, well, if it's virtual, it doesn't exist, like the Metaverse doesn't exist, or NFTs is, something I could just copy or whatever. The biggest asset today isn't gold in terms of market cap. It's intellectual property rights. WIPO estimates that the global intellectual property market is roughly $68 trillion in size, right? And roughly half of the U.S. economy, half of the people employed in the U.S. are all working in IP-related businesses, where IP, trademarks, copyright is actually their primary business. Now, you don't have to look very far. Look at the top 10 companies in the world. What are they? They're IP companies, right? They're maybe Saudi Aramco is the exception. They've got oil. Everyone else, Google, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, they're all IP-based companies. If they don't have intellectual property rights protections, if they can't secure the property rights that they've created, with their know-how, their intellect, their trade secrets, they would all be gone. And we also wouldn't have industry. If we didn't have IP rights, we wouldn't have musicians like Taylor Swift or the Beatles or Michael Jackson because they couldn't protect their music rights either. And yet, these rights are entirely virtual. These are not constructs that are held in a physical fashion. They're ideas, creations, for which you have maybe a limited right to own them exclusively, but you have them in order to encourage that. I think it was in the 17th century where the first copyright law, which is called the Statute of Anne, first emerged. And it's interesting to correlate that moment, that when the copyright law came about, we saw a flourishing of authors, writers, scientists, because all their ideas could now become capital assets as well. And so that's kind of how we think of it the same way, which is that in the virtual world, we don't have any of these digital rights. So we're not just digital serfs. We can't capitalize them. We can't create value. The incentives to do stuff digitally doesn't exist because there's no money involved. There's no capitalist incentive, no entrepreneurialism in that way. But when you give them property rights, you do that.
But now AI is complicating this even further, with large language models ingesting entire movies, music, and all the work already publicly available.
Yes.
And then creating their own music. And, Sam Altman was there at TED this year, and this is exactly the question asked to him, that who is he going to pay royalty to for music generated or images created on their platform, which was learnt from all the artists who have put their life into it.
Yeah. So I think to us, the answer is obvious. And the answer is that if you take data and asset and knowledge and know-how from someone else, you ought to share that value back. Where the distinction can be made is whether that value is monetary or not. Meaning you could be paid for it, but even maybe you don't get paid for it, but at least you get attributed to it. Right? So one of the big gripes I would have with ChatGPT is you ask them a question and they tell you everything you want them to know and they give you zero attribution. It doesn't tell you what your sources are, what they got their ideas from. When you do that in school, you flunk out. Right? So we're taught not to plagiarize. And ChatGPT is probably the biggest mass plagiarizer in the world. Right?
Wow, that's a very good way to think about this.
So that's actually really, it's wrong. That's not to say that the service they're offered is valuable. It is. But you need to give it credit, because the credit, again, doesn't have to be monetary. You don't, sure, with blockchain, you can sort of tokenize it and you can sort of prove through a hash who has the ownership. And maybe you get value from that. But more importantly, it's to attribute the value. For instance, look at open source. Open source is a barter form. I create code, and if I like your code, I know you're a good coder. I can see that basically from the GitHub. And I might hire you for a larger salary or for an opportunity. So even though I didn't get paid for it, I still benefit from it in either direct or indirect ways. Right? Or even, I'm not a big fan of things like Spotify because I think they're very extractive. But at the end of the day, I still know the name of the artist. Yeah. So if I want to hire you for a gig, I can still do so. But if you're an AI that subsumes all your data, actually, I don't know who you are. And eventually you get to a point where all human creation becomes anonymized, and I think that's actually worse. And actually, that's not how we build social connections. And I think that needs to be solved for. So that's kind of the problem that we have.
So Open Campus is your bet on reimagining the world of education. Tell me, how is AI and blockchain going to disrupt that?
Well, there's a lot of ways. Let me first start on the AI side of things. For instance, with TinyTab, they just launched this thing called Eddie, and that's basically an AI tutor. And what TinyTab has done, it actually allows teachers to create content, which they've been monetizing, actually in the form of NFTs as intellectual property rights. And there's something like 200,000 teachers on it, and they're making exclusive content on it, almost in a Netflix-like model. But that content can now be used by an AI to create other forms of knowledge that can then basically be shared with students in a customized way. And then, of course, value can be distributed to all the teachers who have contributed to that data. So that's another way in which your value of what you've created can be shared across.
That's how actually LLMs should be doing it then.
I think LLMs should be doing that. And in this case, also because it's teachers creating it, using things like core curriculum, it's also something that is actually sort of certified, as it were. One of the problems that you have with AI, as you know, is that if this data source is not clean or corrupted or messy, like for instance, you might ask a question to ChatGPT, for instance, and ChatGPT might actually give you sometimes nonsense because the data source is from everything on the internet, which is both true and false. But in this case, it's curated by teachers themselves who create that content. So it's a much more cleaner source. And you can see this also what's happening in the future broadly of AI. For instance, even for ourselves, when we're making products or games, we actually use AI models, but then feed it with data that we wanted to see and have in order to create sort of better and more refined outcomes, rather than just broadly taking whatever else there is in the internet. But when you introduce blockchain, you also introduce elements of finance, value, and money. And what does blockchain do really well? It does things better, faster, cheaper. Like, stable coins, for instance, is a perfect example of that, or even Bitcoin as a store of value. Again, all those things better, faster, cheaper. And one of the great things that we just announced a couple of days ago, we announced sort of the $10 million loan program and an investment into Pencil Finance, which is built on Open Campus, the EDU ecosystem, that provides student loans through DeFi.
Wow.
So decentralized student loans. Now, to sort of just talk about that problem a little bit, in places like Philippines, Indonesia, which is the primary markets right now, but possibly India as well, the loan amounts aren't large. It's like $500 per semester, but they pay up to 30% interest. Why do they pay up to 30% interest? Because the actual capital providers are probably charging anywhere from 10 to 15. And then you have to pass that cost on to the service provider who deals with giving the loans, and then basically on to the students. And so this becomes really extortionate, but they don't have any other choices. But what you can do now with DeFi is you can get optimized yield, right? Through sort of trading and staking and so on. That staking reward can now actually go back by sort of reducing the interest cost for the students. More importantly, and I think this is how we think about the future of work, the student now gets a wallet, which means he opens up to the world of Web3. And not only does it aid in Web3 adoption, it means that student can now be the beneficiary of airdrops and other rewards, doing virtual work in this case, in which they can earn some income, which we saw happening in places like the Philippines and other places around the world as well. Right? So we think it's just a better pathway and is a good student solve. And one of the reasons we focus on student loans is most people don't really, might not know, but there is a student loan market is $3 trillion in size.
Even India has a huge population of students who go abroad, and they're
Right.
all either taking loans or parents are really figuring out a way to save and pay for them.
Or maybe they have different types of loans or collateral they provide. And it's $3 trillion. Now, if we take just 10% of that $3 trillion and put it on chain, because again, it's cheaper, faster, better, you're actually tripling the size of DeFi TVL in the ecosystem today.
Wow.
Right? And that's demonstrative to me of two things. One, it shows that even though there's $100 billion in TVL on DeFi and Web3 today, which is, by the way, akin to basically foreign reserves of some of the biggest national banks in the world, it's still a relatively small amount when you think about the amount of capital that exists around the world that should be going on chain.
And I think using the same philosophy, what we are doing at GoKey and UHT, I think that's really what we are trying to do with reimagining the world of healthcare.
Absolutely.
So I know you were one of the early backers of us. So what kind of got you into the world of healthcare? And I know you are yourself very big into health and fitness.
Well, so I mean, I would say I'm very big into health and fitness, but I think I don't. Did we meet at? We probably met at TED in Edinburgh. I think 2011.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if you remember, but I basically could barely walk. And what happened was that I was actually a lot fatter. My waist was wide. It was like 36 inches, which for me is kind of big. And so I didn't take care of my health. And my L5 basically got crushed because of the fact that beds I guess in Europe are just really soft. And the weight just kind of caved in. And that morning, I just couldn't get up. I was like in so much pain. And that's because my nerve got pinched at the L5. And so I was like quasi-paralyzed. I managed to kind of roll out and sort of managed, but I was literally like, I should have been in crutches. That's how bad it was. So that was like the wake-up call. And that wake-up call experience led me to sort of hiking. You know, my wife put me on a tennis regime. I went on the ketogenic diet. I went like absolute extreme, you know, lost like 12, 15 kilos, which was also a lot for me because I don't have that much weight on me, relatively speaking. I'm not very big. But it completely transformed my life. And I saw the benefits. And in fact, I would argue that I was healthiest in my 40s than I was any time in my 30s, and perhaps even the late 20s, right? And that's because you focus on work and you have children and so forth. And also you kind of carry at least in my case, carry that youthful invincibility to your older age, right? Your metabolism changes. You're just not as strong as anymore. But you somehow,
in your mind,
you are, right?
Yeah.
You're still that fit. And suddenly you're going up the stairs and you're like, basically you're not able to walk. And so you realize you got to do something. So I think I became very, very fit. Now I would say I'm average fit, but I became very, very fit in my early 40s, and sort of hiking the world and so on as well. It's something that became almost like my sort of, I guess, adrenaline rush and my personal drug almost of sorts. So leading on to, you know, the problems I see in the rest of the world. And again, we talked about how ideas are formed and entrepreneurship. And I'm not going to build everything, but I certainly know problems I want to solve. And so we need to solve the world to have better health, because the journey that I had, or other people had, I think you had a similar journey of some sort in personal health, is actually one of everyone for whatever reason. And so investing in something is not only about how can we make society better and improve the state of the world, which is kind of what I think certainly what you're doing with Goki is the case. It's also one where you think it's a trend. If you believe that the world is getting less healthy, then you need solutions to do that. So that also means it's a business opportunity, and it's something that can encourage entrepreneurs. So that combination is basically why, you know, I of course invested in Goki.
No, and I think UHT is
And
truly
UHT, yes.
our whole idea of reimagining how people are going to be incentivized and how people are going to start looking at the futures of health, if the futures market.
Yeah,
too,
and I think a lot of people don't think about data as really one of the most valuable aspects of, you know, what health can create and generate. I think, you know, when 23andMe went bust, there was this big scandal about, so who owns the genetic data now? And there was a court ruling that said whoever buys the company will own that data. I don't think that people who gave
So I had to scramble to delete all my data because we all got free tested at TED.
Right. Yeah. But as a result, someone is likely will buy the remaining assets of 23andMe, and they will have our genetic data, which, if you think about it, is about as personal as it gets, right? And without without even needing our permission, because that data never really belonged to us in the first place.
So on talking about health, right? Every time I refresh my screen, you are at Davos, you are at TED, you are in Neom, you are at Saudi, you are at Token, you are in Dubai. How do you manage this life where you are constantly shifting time zones and constantly looking at newer ideas? Because all these places are very high energy, full of ideas. So how do you keep your A game even when you are traveling with so much stress?
Well, so first I would say that I maintain my game primarily because I have a regime in terms of health and fitness that sort of powers me. So I no longer can hike or bike the way that I used to because I'm not in a place to do that. But I do, a gym routine, I maybe swim, nothing too extreme, but enough to basically keep me going. But really, the thing that drives me is the fact that I love what I do, getting new ideas and sort of working with, and seeing great founders like yourself build new creative products that change the world inspires me and gives me energy as well. So it's not just a case of, like, it's not that I enjoy travel because of travel in and of itself. I enjoy what I experience when I travel. Some people enjoy the scenery. I enjoy seeing companies build awesome stuff, for instance, right? And the impact that it develops. And also, the work that we do, I think, is important. And we're quite a mission-oriented company, and I do believe very much in living a life with impact and purpose. So if that's the purpose, and we want to create impact, then you could say it's a sacrifice, and to some extent it is. But it is a worthy sacrifice. It is something that it's okay to do because the outcome is going to be broadly better. And for me, the decision matrix is, would I regret not having done it? Right? Do I think this is a outcome where I feel like, damn, maybe I should have done this. Maybe I should have really promoted this or whatever. For instance, in our industry, we were heavily affected when SBF, the whole FTX scandal happened, right? Our industry was collapsing. Everyone was sort of running away. Everyone was calling everyone in the industry a scammer, all that type of stuff. Most of my peers started hiding. Not because they were doing anything bad, but because they were maybe a little ashamed. It was a little embarrassing. It's like, you're in a room and people say, "What do you do?" I'm in Web3, right? and what is that? Oh, we deal in crypto, right? And basically, that was people were just not talking about it, and we decided to do the opposite. We decided that actually, this is a good thing. We're proud of it, and if you don't like it, so be it. We're going to go out there. And that was a year then we did the TED Talk. Yeah. And I remember they had to shut off the comments on YouTube because everyone on YouTube was basically saying, oh, scammer, FTX, all that kind of stuff. Not even looking at the content or what I was trying to say, just saying, oh, this relates to token and Web3, forget it. And by the way, this is an interesting thing as well. You see how polarized the world is still even today about this topic. So if I'm on X, right, you talk about tokens and Web3 and blockchain, generally positive sentiment, some criticism, but broadly speaking, an audience that seems savvy, knowledgeable, and broadly positive about the future. And then you go on something like Blue Sky, which is, of course, very Democrat, left-leaning. And there, the narrative is Web3 is dead, nobody cares about it, and there's no distinction between, they don't sort of distinguish Bitcoin as something that's connected to Web3. They just basically look at Bitcoin as something entirely separate, and Web3 is basically dead and doesn't exist, and nobody cares about NFTs anymore, even though NFTs is still $500 million of sales, a month. Yep. So it just shows how we are in these bubbles that don't really talk to each other, and we felt it was really important to go out and spread that mission. And we could have made the decision to basically just sort of stay in hiding. Maybe it would be easier, it would be less travel. But would we think that was the right thing to do? And we thought it wasn't. And that basically guided our decision.
So you were at Davos now for a couple of years, and you were also at Token. Mm-hmm. These are two different universes, literally, right? The old school is Davos, and the new school is the Token and what's happening in Dubai and all these places. Do you really think that the old world is ever going to get crypto and blockchain and Web3 and NFTs?
I think it's already happening. I mean, if you look at, for instance, the institutional flows into Bitcoin, right, with BlackRock and like companies like VanEck and
but somehow they're like, now Bitcoin is separate and everything else is bad. Now it's like a Bitcoin and altcoins. They're kind of doing
but
that.
It's already extending into. If you look at the kind of ETFs that are being proposed, whether it's Solana, Ethereum, right? I mean, basically, even Pudgy Penguins basically is coming out with at least proposing to do an ETF, right? So you see all of these other assets coming out in basically these ways. And if you look at public companies right now, there's a rush for public companies to go public as well. And the valuations are pretty strong. So you can kind of see it becoming more and more mainstream. And in Davos, what was interesting is that, yes, at Congress, there was really only a few talks about crypto, but there were a few, better than none, right? Because in the years before, sometimes you had nothing. However, when you go outside of Congress, it's all crypto, right? Yeah, you've got everyone's talking about crypto. And that's because it's the future of finance. And the people around that understand it. You talk to someone in New York, right, or in London, Right? You'll find either centers of finance or Hong Kong for the matter, or Dubai for the matter. Let's take Dubai and Hong Kong a little bit away because you could say that they're more pro-crypto. But you look at New York, you look at London, these are traditional centers of finance, and everyone's talking about crypto. And they're not specifically only talking about Bitcoin. They're talking about crypto at large. So I would say it's already happening. And I think that path has become somewhat inevitable.
So one of the most defining moments in the world of crypto was when the meme coin Trump, the Trump meme coin was launched.
Yes, sure.
And of course, it kind of created a different kind of wave. So this whole trend of meme coins, where there is no real asset behind the product, or there's
Yeah.
nothing really behind it, and is that good or bad for the
Yeah. So first,
ecosystem?
I think one has to understand why meme coins even started. Meme coins, especially in the last couple of years, their origin began because of what the SEC was doing. The SEC was basically saying every token is kind of a security, and you're raising money and all that kind of stuff. Therefore, we assume that that's a security and we'll go after you, right? Everyone knew that the US was very hostile around it. So if I launch a token, which I distribute everything on day one, that says it has no utility, I am telling you it has zero value, it's nonsense, it's a joke, don't buy it, then you've done all the right messaging. Nobody can come after you and say, but you sold a security. I never said that. I told you not to buy it. I told you it's a joke, it's a meme, and that's actually what happened. So people started launching meme coins really as a way to get around all of this sort of regulatory framework so they wouldn't get accused. Now, I'm not saying that meme coins are going to go away, but they're definitely diminished, not just because of Trump, which was really an incredible vampire attack on the meme coin community, I would say. It's also because now we can start, and especially when the US starts clarifying what is a utility token, which we believe they'll do by Q3, if not Q4, many, many large corporations as well as small organizations are going to launch lots of tokens because they now know what is a security and what isn't. Because right now we still don't know. Right? And I think that's actually going to change this meme coin launch where, okay, I can now launch a token that has this utility, that is used in this way, and you have that understanding. And I follow this framework knowing that it's not a security. And that means meme coin launches will change as a result of that. I also expect the meme coins are going to then be hunting utility of their own, meaning that meme coins are going to say, I'm making a game, or I'm associated with this game, or I'm maybe even launching my own layer 1, layer 2 blockchain. They're going to have to add utility to become relevant or to stay relevant. The thing that tokens do, and this is what I've sort of found so fascinating as I sort of learned about this industry, is that tokens actually are, much like commodities in stock markets, market price indicators. They tell you about what the world is thinking at that moment in time. I give this example often where, I became cool with my kids for a short period of time because I was able to talk about Chill Guy. Now, Chill Guy was very popular on TikTok. I'm not on TikTok. How would I know about it? Because it was a meme token, right? And likewise, why are AI tokens doing so incredibly well last year, even though AI and blockchain was still very early days in comparison to OpenAI? Because the rest of the world was talking about AI, right? So it tells you about where is attention, it tells you about sentiment, and it tells you a lot about where you should put your resources to, at least from a market pricing standpoint. It's kind of like an open poly market. And that's the same for things like gaming. Like, for instance, in 21 and 22, gaming and Metaverse was macro hot because of COVID and the fact that Facebook renamed itself to Meta.
Yeah.
And all the gaming tokens were flying, just like the stock market as well. And again, it wasn't reflective of the size of the market. Like, Web3 gaming was about only 1 million daily active users in late 21. Today we have 7 million daily active users and like 100 million registered users. But the attention for gaming isn't nearly as big in Web3, and has nothing to do with the utility of Web3 gaming. It has more to do with the macro sentiment of gaming at this moment in time.
So the youngsters of today, the degens, understand Web3 and crypto more than, the Gen Z and Gen X.
I would say it's native to their thinking. I don't know that they necessarily understand it, but there's a fluency. By understand it, I don't mean maybe they don't break it down. Like, I think of it as like culture it's a culture, right? And culture is a kind of a language. So if you grow up, I grew up in Austria, and I speak fluent German. But if you have to ask me to break down the grammar rules about capitalization, accusative, dative, all these rules, I probably couldn't tell it to you at this point. It's just something that is fluent to me, but it's not something that I could break down, right? which, for instance, in some languages they have genders, right? If you grew up in there, they intuitively know it because they've got to learn it in this fashion. But actually, someone who just learned the language knows the rules, but isn't that naturally fluent. And I think, the younger generation is much more fluent in all things digital, especially in Web3.
So, given all the stuff happening, with AI is creating their own blockchain and meme coins and paying people, do you think in the future we would actually be working for some kind of an autonomous DAO, which is actually totally controlled by AI agents? And what will be my purpose?
So first, I think the moment where we're working for a protocol has already happened, right? And if you get an airdrop, you're working for a protocol. Sure, there's humans in the back doing some stuff, but the reality is that you're not working for the human. You're working for, the DAO or the L1, L2, or for a game, right? You're not working for an individual or a set of companies or a company per se, right? So that paradigm has already shifted. And just sort of to talk about a little bit about sort of how these things are governed, we think that's actually why DAOs are the perfect solution for that. Because a DAO is a way in which, through tokenization, the community has ownership and can guide where it goes, even if the AI the AI might make its own decisions, but you can guide where it goes because of the fact that the DAO basically is programmed to sort of make these decisions. And do we imagine a future where we're only going to be working for AIs? No, I think AI is going to make life more simpler. I think it frees us up to do more creative work, which I think we as humans are more naturally inclined to do. And I go back to do you remember that sort of famous TED Talk from the late Sir Ken Robinson, where he talked about schools kill creativity? And a lot of the body of his work came from the study in the 60s from, I think it was George Land and Beth Jarvis, I think that was the name. And there was a study that showed how children, they followed them from the age of 5 until 15, and they basically did a divergent thinking test. And the divergent thinking test basically was one that they originally created for NASA, because when you send someone to the moon in like the 50s and 60s or somewhere in space, there is no guidebook that says, how do you solve this problem? So it was a way to determine whether this NASA scientist or astronaut was very divergent in their thinking. Could they problem solve? Could they be creative? So they took a similar version of this test and adapted it for children that were 5, 10, 15, and then did the same test to adults. And they followed them. The adults they did later. The 5-year-old scored, I think, 97% creative. Guess what the 10-year-old scored?
20%?
It's about 30-something.
30. Wow.
Right? And by the time they were teenagers, it was like, I think, 11%.
Creativity is getting dropped.
It's getting dropped. And the argument being that because of conformity, because of schooling systems, because of social pressure,
and
in structure, you basically sort of tearing down that sort of framework of creativity and divergent thinking that you had. And the adults, 2%, right? So basically, the majority of adults were sort of not creative at all and very convergent in approaches. What got me thinking was, okay, so if that's true, which it appears to be, there's something else that's interesting. What do you think is the percentage of people who are entrepreneurs or change makers in the world?
Less than 1%.
Single-digit percentage as well. It's that 2% that are creative. So there is a direct correlation. So if we want to sort of construct sort of a world that is more creative and sort of more human, actually we need to preserve our creativity and our divergent thinking. And that's the reason, by the way, why we started focusing on education very early on in a different way, both with Dalton in Hong Kong and some of our efforts, because what we thought was, if we can find ways to preserve creativity at the younger age, at the top of the funnel, right? If you can do that, you can get a double-digit outcome at the bottom, right? Because again, to double the entrepreneurial index, you don't need 20%. You go from 2 to 4, right? Or from 4 to 8, right? That's what we need. And how do we do that? If we can preserve that creativity right at kindergarten, all the way through primary school, even though there's a drop-off, maybe at the end of the funnel, you will have 10% more people that remain creative and divergent in their thinking, which means you have 5 times more people who could become entrepreneurs and change makers in the world.
So today, if you are a young person, or even if you are somebody who's already working for an organization, you are scared. Every day there is news that AI is going to take away jobs. People don't know what's going to happen with, there's so much of instability in the world with trade wars and, geographical issues happening everywhere. So what is the Yat Siu code for people who are now in this uncertain world and with all these things happening? What is your advice to people? How should they approach this world of Web3, crypto, AI, and the future?
Well, I mean, this is a big question. I don't pretend to have the answers for that. But the one thing that I think we need to teach everyone is that change is the only constant. And that's something that we have to feel comfortable with. And one of the reasons why I think Web3 is so interesting is that we have so much volatility and it's visible to us. And we like to pretend that the world isn't volatile because we like stability, right? We want that safety. But we live in a capitalist world. And if you sort of were to measure how many people lose their job every day around the world and how many people gain new jobs every day in the world, or how many businesses shut down every week and how many businesses open every week, it's not a straight line. It's like this.
Yeah.
But we're given a macro annual chart and says 5% unemployment, which looks like it's a very thin line, and X numbers of companies that are out there that always seem to be roughly the same. But when you chart it basically on a timestamp that is shortened, it's super volatile. And I actually think that that's what we as humans are originally designed for, as in we are designed for stresses and volatility and change. Because if we are only stable, then we can't change.
We are like a rock. Then.
Yeah, and we don't grow, right? So this whole friction, which seems uncomfortable and uncertain, is actually, I think, part of our human design, part of our human DNA. It differentiates between us. It's not evolution in the sort of Darwinistic perspective in terms of changing your environment. It's our intellectual capacity, it's our creative capacity, it's our ability to create, in fact, that actually differentiates us, and therefore we have this ability to create both beautiful things but also destructive things, right? You think about the human capacity. We are scared about the destructive capacity that we can create. At the same time, though, on average, we seem to be creating very beautiful, amazingly new innovations and changes as well that impact the world. I think that's just our nature. I don't think we can go away from that. If we do, then I think it takes away what makes us really human.
That was so beautifully put, Yat. I think that's what keeps you so calm in this chaos. And I think that's the one quality which I totally love in you, that may anything happen in the world, your calm demeanor, your kind words, and your nature to help everybody and make a difference to society is what has got you here. So keep doing up the great work. I'm so happy to have you on the show. Thanks for all your time. And to our viewers out there, if this talk from Yat is not going to make you imbibe and adopt to the change, nothing else would. Keep getting inspired, keep learning, and keep getting awakened. Thank you once again.
Thank you.